The cry of Vikings struck terror into the hearts of anyone who lived near the coast. But who were they? One June day in the year 793 AD, the monks of an island monastery of Lindisfarne in Northumbria were kneeling at prayer, as usual, when a cry of alarm sent them rushing to the window. There, in the crashing surf, were beached a dozen or more long, sleek, wooden boats, each with a menacing prow rearing like a dragon's head and a vast billowing square sail. As the horrified monks watched, scores of huge bearded warriors leaped over the gunwales of the boat and into the waves. Long hair streamed out beneath their conical helmets as they waded through the foam to the shore. Some were bearing great double-edged swords, almost a metre long. Others were wielding long spears or battle axes with giant blades. Each of them carried a huge, round, wooden shield covered in leather and painted red, yellow, black, or white. Terrible, strange yells of Heil and Thor echoed off the rocks and struck terror into the hearts of the defenceless monks. Within minutes, the Vikings, for Vikings they were, had reached the monastery. There they began their work of bloody destruction. Some hours later they left, carrying with them most of the monastery's valuable treasures. Behind them lay a scene of awful destruction, monks dead and wounded, the altar trampled and broken, and books and manuscripts torn and burned. The news of this outrage spread across England like wildfire, and soon everyone was claiming that they had seen terrible omens, immense whirlwinds, terrible flashes of lightning, and fiery dragons in the sky. It is nearly 350 years that we and our fathers have inhabited this most lovely island, wrote the shocked Bishop Alison of York, and never before has such terror appeared in Britain as we have now suffered from a pagan race. Soon similar tales of Viking outrages were being told all over Europe, where hundreds of churches and villages fell victim to the raiders from the sea. Everywhere the cry rang out from the fury of the Northmen, "O Lord, deliver us." Full of gold and silver, and often in isolated, undefended sites, churches and monasteries were often the target of Viking raids. If Christians were shocked by such sacrilege, it did not bother the Vikings, who had their own gods. But ordinary farming folk suffered too, and many a poor peasant found his wife and children carried off into slavery. The monks had their revenge on the Vikings by writing about them in lurid detail, and it is largely due to the monks that the popular image of the Vikings as savage warriors was spread. To the monks they were stinging hornets, wild beasts who struck like a savage hurricane, burning everything that was not worth stealing and killing anyone not worth enslaving. But recent archaeological research suggests that the Vikings may not have been quite as bad as the monks made out. No one knows just what the word Viking means or who first used it. However, it came to describe all the sea raiders from Scandinavia, whether they were from what is now Denmark, Norway, or Sweden. The Scandinavians or Norsemen were by no means all warriors and pirates. Many spent their lives fishing or farming as peacefully as any Anglo-Saxon. Indeed, some people say it was simply a shortage of good farming land in their homelands that drove the Vikings to plundering overseas. Their longships and their remarkable skill in seamanship took the Vikings much further afield from their homelands than is often remembered. England and Ireland were not the only places to suffer at their hands. Vikings raided as far afield as Iceland and Paris, and brave Viking chieftains, Halston and Bjorn Ironside, led a band of longships on a plundering raid right around Spain and well beyond Italy, stopping at Algeciras and Algeria on the way. Vikings even sailed right across the Atlantic to Vinland, part of North America where for a while a small settlement was established, 500 years before Columbus was born. They also roved far to the east, along rivers by boat and on foot. In 852, a band of Vikings descended on the city of Novgorod, exacting money from the citizens before moving on to Kiev. The word Russia comes from Rus, after the Norse name for the Vikings. A little while later, the Vikings launched a daring attack on Byzantium, now Istanbul in Turkey, which they called Mittelgarth, the Great Town, and later the Byzantine Empire even had a bodyguard of these tall blonde warriors from the north. This was the Vangarian Guard. For many years the Vikings were content to plunder. Small fleets of longships, rarely more than 30 strong, struck at lightning at poorly defended coasts and did their bloody work and then vanished over the sea as quickly as they came. Rarely did they linger longer than a day. Often it was just a few hours. As the years wore on, though, the bands of marauders grew to great armies and the Vikings began to stay longer. They started to bring their families and livestock, and it was clear they intended to settle. In England, they moved first into the north and east, then gradually extended their territory further and further inland, despite the efforts of the Anglo-Saxons to stem the tide. King Alfred eventually halted the Vikings' advance, but not before half of England had fallen into their hands. Most Vikings who settled in England were from Denmark, and so their half of the country became known as the Danelaw. The Danes did not drive the English from the territory they occupied altogether. Instead, they settled down beside them to farm and trade. It was the same story in other parts of Europe, where from the late 9th century onwards the Vikings concentrated on acquiring land so that they could settle as farmers and traders. The bloodthirsty heathen image of the Vikings who terrorized the monks has obscured their achievements as a great trading people. Their cargo boats, smaller and broader than the fearsome longships, sailed the waterways of Europe from Greenland to the Caspian Sea. In fact, much of the raided loot was set up to trading stations and ports which grew into thriving cities such as Kiev in Russia and Dublin in Ireland, now over 1,000 years old. 12 years after Alfred's death, Vikings under their leader Rollo were granted Normandy in France. Here they mixed with the natives, adopting the French as their language. Between 870 and 1020, the Vikings became Christians, and after that they were no longer seen as uncivilized people. The land these Northmen lived in would become known as Normandy, the land of the Northmen. The most famous of these Northmen would be William, Duke of Normandy, or as he was known in England, William the Conqueror, victor at the Battle of Hastings in 1066.